Hello and welcome to another of the E-Biology Teacher Podcasts. I'm Mr. Doc, and today we shall be exploring the heart of the matter. Yes. No, we're going to be doing the circulatory system today as we continue looking at the organ systems of animals, particularly mammals, with a particular concentration on humans and fetal pigs. All right, so we're going to be looking at the circulatory system, obviously the heart being the central organ to that. So let's jump right in and find out what it is that we hope to learn. In this video lecture, we're hoping to talk about obviously blood, because that's a key component of the circulatory system. We're also going to be talking about how blood moves through the body and the heart itself. We're going to differentiate between two major types of circulation, one being systemic, the other being pulmonary. And then we're going to talk about how blood plays a role in an organism's immunity. We will not be doing a specific lecture just on the immune system, but we will talk about, at least in this lecture, a little bit about the role of blood and how it helps keep us healthy, if not alive in the first place. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. As a review, remember that the circulatory system it acts as the sort of transport service, not only for oxygen, but also for food and other materials that are needed throughout the body. The heart, blood, and blood vessels are all included in this system, and the vessels on the heart are also key to the lymphatic system, which is your body's fluid regulation mechanism. So they are very similar. Again, not something we're going to go into that detail in, but it's good to know that the lymphatic system, or the body fluid regulation system, and the circulatory system are in fact intimately paired. To start out, let's talk about blood. Blood is made up of four main components. Now, of course, blood is a liquid, so it does have sort of a liquid medium, and that's called plasma. Now, this is not to be confused with the state of matter plasma. Plasma is actually a liquid, but plasma, the state of matter, is not liquid. Anyway, plasma is the liquid medium that blood is in. Also in blood are red blood cells. Now, these are these little red, almost donut-looking shaped cells that carry oxygen to cells and carbon dioxide away from cells. Their shape is very critical, and part of their shape is determined by an iron-based compound called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin readily bonds with our oxygen and with carbon dioxide, and hemoglobin, being iron-based, is what gives blood its uniquely red color, because iron, when it oxidizes or when it bonds with oxygen, takes a redder color, and that is a sort of a neat little thing to note. Blood that is rich in oxygen does have a different color than blood that is deoxygenated. Now, deoxygenated blood isn't blue, like some people like to say, but it is a darker color. When blood does not have oxygen, it's a darker color, and when blood does have a lot of oxygen, it's actually bright ruby red. Just some kind of one of those neat things to know. Hemoglobin, like I said, is an iron-based compound. It does bond with oxygen very readily, and it's what's responsible for giving the cell its color and its shape. If that shape changes, then obviously the cells aren't going to work as readily. So if we have something like sickle cell anemia, that's when the red blood cells take on a different shape and are not as efficient at carrying around oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, white blood cells are the soldiers of the immune system. That is to say that they fight off infection. We're not going to go into super deep detail on these, except to say that there are different types of white blood cells. Some white blood cells go around and recognize infections and mark it with reagents and antibodies. And then there are other white blood cells that come and engulf infections and break down what's causing the infection. So white blood cells really are, and it's a pretty good analogy, they are the soldiers of the immune system. Some go around and they're scouts. They look around for infections. When they find those infections, other cells come around, the tanks, and they destroy whatever infection is there. And of course, the last component is platelets. Platelets are these small, irregularly shaped cells that bond together to form clots to prevent an organism from bleeding an excessive amount. So platelets are what are responsible for forming blood clots, and people who are hemophiliacs are people who have a low platelet count. Well, we've heard a word here a couple times. We might as well go ahead and define what it means, or at least assign a meaning to it. Hemoglobin and hemophiliacs. Heme refers to blood, okay? So hemoglobin is a blood-based compound, and hemophiliac, heme meaning blood, philiac means to love or a lover of. Literally translated means somebody who loves to bleed. That doesn't mean they love to bleed. Ooh, look at me, I like to bleed. It means that their body doesn't clot the blood, so when they do bleed, they do tend to bleed a lot or love to bleed. All right, so that is blood. The heart now is the pump that pushes blood through the body. Now in mammals, including humans and pigs, which we're going to study in more detail, the heart is a four-chambered heart. It has the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. A note that we covered in previous lectures, but might as well repeat ourselves. Right and left are with respect to the organism, not the observer, meaning that this is my right hand even though it's on your left side, and this is my left hand even though it's on your right side. So we say that right and left is to the organism, not to you. So if we're looking at a frontal view of the heart, all right, this is the right side of the heart, this is the left side of the heart. All right, and this is from a model. We'll play with this in a minute. If I did a coronal dissection or a frontal dissection of the heart and removed the front, we would notice that there are distinct spaces within the heart. So this would be the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Okay, boom and boom. Isn't it cute? I heart you. Oh. All right, let's move forward and talk about these in particular. Now, I'm going to go through this, try to go at a steady pace. Hopefully we can keep up. The blood vessel that leads to the heart, and that's where we're going to start, is called the superior and inferior vena cava. So the vena cava are here and here. Now these two blood vessels are going to bring to the heart blood that has been into the body, has dropped off oxygen, and has now picked up carbon dioxide. So this is, for lack of a better term, used blood. Oh, I'm looking like an avatar. Kalima. All right, so the vena cava, the superior vena cava, or vena cava, depending where you're from, brings blood from the upper half of the body, and of course the inferior vena cava brings blood from the lower half of the body into the right atrium. And of course the right atrium is right here, okay? Now, when we have the right atrium and it's going to be receiving used blood, that blood needs to head off to the lungs to pick up some oxygen. So the blood from the right atrium, okay, is going to go from the atrium through the tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular valve, into the right ventricle, okay? The reason why we're showing blue here is because this blood doesn't have oxygen, and that's sort of a common thing in diagramming hearts. The blood in the ventricle, the right ventricle, is going to head out to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. So it's going to go out that way, and of course out that way. Okay? So if you look at the diagram of the heart, you'll notice that the bottom part of the heart really has a whole bunch of musculature around the ventricle. And the top part of the heart, the atria, are very thin. There is a reason for that. All right? So if you look at this diagram here, or this model I should say, these walls up here, the atria, are very thin, and then the walls around the ventricles are very thick. The reason for that is the atria are the receiving tanks of the heart. They're going to receive blood from the body. So if I'm looking at this model, the inferior vena cava is here. See? Yeah, that's it. Okay. The superior vena cava is here. So this is the right atrium. This is the right ventricle. When this ventricle squeezes, it's going to squeeze blood up the pulmonary artery, and this pulmonary artery is headed to, in fact, the lungs to pick up oxygen. And if you remember the respiratory system video lecture that we talked about that. All right, so now we've got the ventricle, and by the way, I need to finish my thought. The reason why the ventricles have thicker walls is because they're the ones that are actually moving the blood around. So the ventricles are going to be the chambers of the heart that have more musculature. You also want to notice that the wall of the left ventricle is a lot thicker even than the right ventricle. That's because the right ventricle only has to send the blood to the lungs. They're neighbors. It's not like they have to go across town. But the left ventricle has a really thick muscular wall because when it pumps, it sends blood to the rest of the body. Okay, so it's going to be bigger, and we'll get to that soon. All right, so we're going to return back. Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, used blood from the body into the right atrium, to the right ventricle, up through the pulmonary artery, and we are headed to the lungs. Now, once we go to the lungs, oxygen exchange is going to happen, right? Then what's going to happen is blood is going to come back from the heart through the pulmonary vein. Okay, in other words, pulmonary refers to the lungs, right? So we have coming in from the pulmonary vein. Now we're in the left atrium. We're going to go past the mitral valve, or the left atrioventricular valve, into the left atrium. All right. From there, we are going to go through what's called the aortic or the semilunar valve, through the aorta to the rest of the body. And of course, the aorta branches off into several different arteries, and the blood goes in all kinds of different directions. Okay. So what do we really need to know about the heart? We've got the superior and inferior vena cava that has used blood going into the right atrium. The right atrium goes to the tricuspid valve, or also called the right atrioventricular valve. Goes into the right ventricle. Right ventricle sends the blood to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary vein brings the blood back to the left atrium. Left atrium through the mitral valve goes to the left ventricle. Left ventricle squeezes the blood past the aortic valve, through the aorta to the rest of the body. Now, if we take a look at another diagram here, this might be a little easier to see. I'm going to go through and draw with my little pen again. All right, here we go. Blood coming in through the superior vena cava into the right atrium, past the right atrioventricular valve, into the right ventricle, out through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. And remember, the lungs are on both sides. Then, on our way back in, from the lungs, we've now have picked up oxygen in the blood, and it's ready to go around the body. So we come back through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta to the rest of the body. All right. Now, there is one note I want to make here. Some people say that you can determine whether something is an artery or a vein, which we're going to talk about in a minute, based on whether the blood has oxygen in it or not. That's not true, because there's one exception, and it's the pulmonary artery and vein. We'll get to that when we talk about it. As a matter of fact, I think it's coming up very soon. Now, the heart is obviously under unconscious control. You don't have control over your heartbeat. Your brain controls it. However, it is on a rhythm base, and there are rhythm type notes or nodes in the heart itself. The first node that we're going to talk about is called the sinoatrial node, and the sinoatrial node is located in the right atrium, and it regulates the actual heart beat. It is the quote-unquote pacemaker node. All right, the sinoatrial node is what determines how fast the heart's going to beat. The second node, which is located in the septum of the heart, which is the wall that exists between the two ventricles, which is right here in our little diagram, the septum, the atrioventricular node, is in the septum, and it controls the pace of the ventricular contractions and the atrial contractions so that they're not contracting at the same time. Okay, so the sinoatrial node determines the pace. The atrioventricular node is what says, okay, atria, now ventricle, atria, now ventricle, all right? And that gives us a time to talk about the actual heartbeat, okay? For blood to move, the chambers are going to contract. So the atria will contract to squeeze blood down through that little valve into the ventricle. That valve, by the way, will close so that blood won't flow back up into the atrium. When the ventricle contracts, it's going to send blood out of the arteries. So if we're looking at the heart, it would obviously make sense for the heart not to all contract at once. The atria must be able to contract, and then the ventricles will contract subsequent to that or after that. So it's like lub-dub. Oh, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. Yes, lub-dub. When you hear your heartbeat, if you put your stethoscope and you hear your heartbeat, you hear this lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. The softer lub sound is the contraction of the atria, and the louder, more forceful sound is the muscular ventricles pushing blood out to either the lungs or the rest of the body. So that's how that works. And of course, the sinoatrial node is what determines the pace. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. But the atrioventricular node here is what controls how quickly the dub comes after the lub. All right? That sounds really stupid, but it's true. The atrioventricular node is what determines when the atria contract, then the ventricles contract. Okay, so it separates them. It prevents the heart from just contracting all four chambers at the same time. All right, now there are two types of blood vessels, main categories of blood vessels, I should say, arteries and veins. Arteries are blood vessels that move away from the heart, and veins are blood vessels that move toward the heart. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some people say, well, that means that arteries all have oxygen-rich blood, and veins all have oxygen-poor blood. That's kind of common, but it's not completely accurate, because when we talk about the pulmonary artery is leaving the heart and headed to the lungs to pick up oxygen. So the pulmonary artery is the exception to that rule, because the pulmonary artery contains blood that does not have a lot of oxygen in it. It is a fact going to the lungs to pick up oxygen. That also means that the pulmonary vein coming back from the lungs has oxygen in it, which means that doesn't work either, because it's a vein, but it's oxygen rich. So a better way to determine whether something's an artery or vein is the direction of blood flow. If the blood is flowing away from the heart, it's an artery. If the blood is flowing toward the heart, it's a vein. And that's the way we roll. All right. Now, we've also mentioned capillaries. That's something, before I move on, capillaries are where the veins and arteries sort of trade off, okay? The arteries get smaller and smaller and smaller, and in the capillaries, they deliver the oxygen, and then the circulatory system makes a circle. Those capillaries return back to veins, and then those veins go back to the heart, and the blood circles through the whole system again. All right? Now, of course, blood pressure is something we'll need to consider. Blood moves through the arteries by pressure created by the heart, because the heart is, in fact, a pump. Now, there are two measures to blood pressure. The first measure of blood pressure is the systolic number. Now, the systolic number is the higher number, and it is the pressure inside the blood vessels when the ventricle is in contraction. So that should be the higher of the two numbers. The diastolic number is the pressure within the ventricle, or it's pressure in the blood vessels when the ventricle is in fact not contracting, or when it's relaxed. So the systolic number is when these chambers are actively pushing blood. So that's going to be the high pressure when they're pushing, systolic. Diastolic is when they relax, and that is the lower number. Now, the average adult blood pressure is 120/80. Okay, now that seems to tell us not a whole lot, but in fact, it tells us quite a bit. If the pressure, if the first number, the systolic number, is excessively high, what it could indicate is that the pressure in your blood vessels when the heart is contracting is extremely high, which means that either the heart is pumping too hard or there's something in the blood vessels causing them to decrease. So that's why people who have cardiovascular disease often have high blood pressure, because something is blocking their arteries, and when something blocks the arteries, it actually increases the pressure. So there's two things we can find out from the systolic number. The diastolic number could tell us about potential circulatory issues. If the pressure is too low in the diastolic number, it means that when the heart isn't actually pumping, the blood isn't moving very much or is coming to almost a standstill. And of course, we know standing still blood doesn't sound good, so it's probably not, right? So if the systolic number is too high, we probably have an overworking heart or blockage. If the diastolic number is too low, chances are our heart's our system is losing pressure and the blood's not moving fast enough. Now, if the diastolic number is too high, what that probably means is our heart is working too much too long. So our heart is overworking, right? Because even when it's relaxed, we still have pretty high pressure. So the blood pressure can actually tell you quite a few things about somebody's medical condition. Another thing is if we are bleeding. If somebody has a massive blood loss, their blood pressure is going to go down because we're removing blood from the system. So the heart may be working just fine, but there's not enough blood to create pressure, because the pressure comes from the pushing and movement of the blood itself. All right? Now, we mentioned this already, capillaries and veins. Arteries get smaller and smaller and smaller. And by the way, they're very muscular in nature. They're almost perfectly round tubes, thick-walled, because they deal with a lot of pressure. They'll eventually get smaller and smaller and turn into capillaries. They branch off and they innervate or go to all the different areas of the body. These thin vessels is where materials are going to be exchanged, including oxygen, which we covered in the respiratory lecture. Capillaries going back to the heart turn into veins and get gradually bigger, and the blood returning to the heart does not really benefit from blood pressure because the capillaries sort of diffuse all that pressure. So we have an issue. Not only are the veins going back up to the heart, but the blood is being pushed by backup. You know, when blood moves in, everything kind of gets lifted. That means that blood does have the potential to backflow in veins. So veins all have these upwardly facing valves that close in between heartbeats to keep blood from pooling in a downward direction and to prevent what we call backflow. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about are types of circulation, and these are actually pretty simple now that we know how the heart works. Okay, we have systemic circulation. That's circulation to everywhere around the body that needs it. But then we have another loop that goes directly to the heart. All right, and that's called pulmonary circulation. Systemic circulation is the circulation of oxygen-rich blood to the cells of the body and that deoxygenated blood back to the heart itself. Pulmonary circulation is the circulation of deoxygenated blood to the lungs and the return of that enriched blood back to the heart. So we've already kind of covered those pathways, but we can now classify them. So really what's happening here is pulmonary circulation is really from the right ventricle to the left atrium. And so it goes from the right ventricle to the lungs and back to the left atrium. Systemic circulation is from the left ventricle to the body back to the right atrium. So the blood is going everywhere else. So systemic circulation is the delivery of oxygen to the entire body, the head, neck, shoulders, extremities, whatever. Pulmonary circulation is the circulation of blood between the heart and the lungs to enrich the blood. So let's take a look at our objectives and see what we learned. First of all, the components of blood. We know our red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Plasma is the liquid medium. Red blood cells are the little red donut-looking cells that carry oxygen by having a chemical compound called hemoglobin. And we know that if they're not shaped properly, they won't carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. We also know it's what gives blood its red color because the iron and the oxygen make it appear red. White blood cells are the soldiers of the immune system. They will attack invaders. They will mark them, and they will mark them for destruction. And that's why we have white blood cells. And of course, platelets prevent us from bleeding because they are irregularly shaped cells that bond together to form clots. To trace the flow of blood through the body and the heart itself, we're going to come back to our little heart. Remember, blood that has been used, it's deoxygenated, needs to pick up some oxygen, comes to the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Through the right atrium to the right ventricle, out the pulmonary artery to the lungs. This, by the way, pulmonary circulation. The lungs enrich that blood with oxygen and return the blood through the pulmonary vein to the left atrium to the left ventricle contracts, sending the blood through the aorta to the rest of the body, where it drops off oxygen, picks up carbon dioxide, comes back to the superior and inferior vena cava, right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery, lungs, pulmonary vein, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, back to the body, and back again. Now, if you get a chance, I suggest you looking up a song. It's on the internet somewhere. You'll be able to find it. It's called Pumps Your Blood. I'm not going to play it here because it's probably copyrighted or something. But it's pump, 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 and it goes through the entire circulation system. If you can memorize that song, like you memorize all the other songs that are on the radio, it will give you the path of blood through the body and through the heart itself. So Pumps Your Blood is the name of the song. I think you might like it. The last little bit here, we've told you about systemic and pulmonary circulation. Systemic circulation being circulation of oxygen-rich blood to the body and the return of that blood with carbon dioxide back to the heart. Pulmonary circulation is the movement of the oxygen-poor blood to the lungs to be enriched and back to the heart so it can enter into systemic circulation. And finally, we know that white blood cells play a role in immunity because they have different roles to play. Some white blood cells mark infections, some white blood cells attack infections based on the markers, and that's how they work. I hope this has helped. Remember to be on the lookout for the next podcast, which will be a subsequent one to this circulatory system. It will be the fetal pig circulatory dissection. Okay, so we're doing the compound video lectures. We're doing a lecture to establish, and then we're going to do the fetal pig later on. I will see you later, and I'll remember, as always, I heart you. See you later. I'm a cheeseball.